deep, it's hardwired. So welcome to this. Now I have to count fourth day of the 2024 Bergen Exchanges. And I'm happy to see you here for this session, which is also a book launch. It's a launch of Kristin Bergtora Sandvik's book on humanitarian extractivism, the digital transformation of aid. And we are really looking forward to hearing you tell us about this book, and then we'll have a panel discussion afterwards. But before I give you the word, I'll just introduce you very briefly. Many of you know Kristin already. She's a repeat player at the Bergen Exchanges. Good for us. And when she's not here, she's a professor at the University of Oslo, in law and public law, and also a researcher at TEO, which is the Peace Center in Oslo. So, the floor is yours.
So thank you for having me, and thank you for coming. Oops, the last here. So I was thinking, Siri, I think you've been sort of offering care for me for 20 years now. So I'm very, very grateful for knowing you and for being able to come here and for being able to engage with the audience. So this is a week full of thoughts on social transformation, on social justice, on litigation, on what we can do to affect social change. So what I'll do now is I'm going to talk about a sector where there is no theory of social change. There's no real talk about justice. There's no law. There's no, except for IHL, there's no litigation, and there are really few lawyers. And they also pretend it's not political. And this is the humanitarian aid field. So what I'll do now is I'll give sort of a brief recap of the book, but I'll try to sort of present you with this argument about what the digital transformation is doing to aid, and sort of how we can think about politics, because moving into an area where the crisis seems to be perpetual, Gaza, COVID, civil wars, Sudan, natural disasters, famines, the humanitarian sector is a very integral part of global governance. And I do think that we need to include the sector when we think about transformation. So what is this book about? It didn't start out as a book about extractivism. I had a very long title. The reviewer came back and said, this is extremely boring. This is a book about extractivism. So good idea, fine, I'll do that. And it sort of captures my work in the aid sector as an academic, ethics advisor, commentator. I've been part of drafting codes of conduct, sitting around the table, and sort of being kind of an insider, outsider. And so when I say we, it's probably also because at the back of my mind, I'm some sort of humanitarian worker myself. Book has 6 chapters. It's a fairly short thing. I was a little disappointed when I got the book. I spent all this time and it's just sort of flat. But the intention is that it's actually not written only for you guys. It's also to be read by practitioners in the field. So first chapter discusses what I call digital bodies in aid. So maybe 30 years ago, as a refugee, you would register. It would be on paper. It wouldn't be glorious. The paper would turn into paper mache, be lost in UNHCR toilet. Somebody would spill the coffee on it. But today, if you are receiving aid, the system can no longer see you unless you're willing to give up all your biodata and biometric data. This means that to be legible, you have to acquire a digital body. That's sort of the matrix of imagery, biometrics, I think in the future, probably DNA, and whatever files they have on you, meshed up with sort of reports and analysis and geodata about where you come from and sort of the conflict you're part of. This digital body is immutable in the sense that people have very little influence. If information changes, even if you stop being a refugee, they sit on the file. It used to be on the little local database. Now it sits on a global database. And it sits there forever, right? And it can be accessed by many more people. It's also relational to a certain extent. So your file would say, I'm related to so-and-so. Once DNA enters the equation, this relates you to people in the future and in the past. It plots you into very different transnational context. So the digital body has really become sort of a key issue, I think, when we think about humanitarian aid. Then I'm talking about cybersecurity, and my example is one of the few publicly known hacks. I mean, obviously organizations are getting hacked all the time. And this was the International Red Cross getting hacked back in 2022, 21, discovered in 22. The reason this hack is interesting is because ICRC is really an excellent organization. It's probably the most loved and respected actor in the humanitarian field. So if UNHCR had gotten hacked, all of us commentators would have been, angry, and it's typical UNHCR, and shouldn't they be pulling themselves together, and this is so irresponsible. When ICRC got hacked, we were all just sitting around and giving comments like, this is horrible. You would hack the ICRC. And so there's a lack of sort of critical engagement with the humanitarian cyberspace in this field. And this hack didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, my point is that, the way we conduct our operations is we create vulnerabilities. And I'll get back to this, both in terms of the databases we create, but also who we think are the humanitarian subjects. So, for example, if you start engaging with irregular migrants, you get a very vulnerable new population on the books, with more stakeholders being, quote unquote, interested. Then there's a chapter on humanitarian work and sort of the digital transformation of that work, who's involved, who has a voice, from kind of the tech bro period until this has sort of globalized, and what it means for, how we conduct operations from afar and close up. Then I have a chapter on UNICEF. So I don't know if you remember a decade back, it was very trendy with innovation contests. Hackathons, we would sit there and do blah, blah, blah challenges and pretend to be able to innovate ourselves out of some problems by, getting together in a room and having pizza and coding a lot. What I thought was super interesting with this example is UNICEF has done private sector collaborations always, but it is very sophisticated and large actor. And I looked at this challenge. I actually started off writing a paper on the Cushy Baby, which was an infant biometric necklace that would trace vaccines for kids. And I wrote about Cushy Baby, they won. But then I went back to the competition itself. And I thought this was going to be a challenge where you would focus on the kids and, how can we actually use wearables to improve child welfare? And then I realized that this was not about the children. This was about UNICEF finding something useful to do with their private sector partners. It was like not speed dating, but it was a dating arrangement. How can you and I do something meaningful together? Let's have a walk in the woods. So, and I think that's a lot of this is maybe the challenge with the humanitarian innovation paradigm, that the humanitarian sector is trying to collaborate with the private sector and trying to sort of find useful ways of engaging. And given that the humanitarians sit at the short end of the table, I don't know if that's a term, it is complicated to try to work with big tech. So back then, humanitarians were still tinkering. You remember the refugee crisis when everybody had their app. That period finished. Now, increasingly, humanitarians source from big tech in the digital humanitarian supply chain. So that's maybe a change from a decade ago. You wouldn't find those innovation challenges anymore, but the sector is still really struggling to collaborate with private sector partners. I went to a high sort of profile policy summit a couple of months ago, and the hosting government told me that they hadn't been able to convince Google and Meta and Amazon to send people to that meeting. And if that government cannot convince people to their staff to attend, no one else can. It's really, they're just disinterested. Then I done work on drones for a long time. So trying to figure out, what we talk about humanitarian space. We usually think about the ground, right? But actually humanitarians have been, part of flying those airplanes for a long time. And then what does it mean that you start making airspace into drone airspace? We have these imaginaries in the beginning, it's this kind of, oh, we can drop medicine, we can provide aid, and it's going to be super useful. Today, we take this much more seriously after the Ukraine warfare, where I think we know that, drones it's real. Back when I started working on it, it was sort of very utopian. Now it's actually physically real and it's there. I should also say that this fall we're hosting a webinar with probably the White Helmets and a couple of other actors talking about drone attacks against neighborhoods. Particularly governments have now started using drones to target aid operations, and this is new. And how do you protect yourself beyond sort of distinction? Last chapter is based on a huge project on disaster innovation, where I was the ethics advisor, and it was sort of a global project, but looking at how Silicon Valley ethics are translated in the field. It's sort of, for lawyers, they kind of make fun of ethics, right? It's like, it's not even soft law, it's like soft something. And then we, particularly in the ethics field, there has been a lot of criticism of ethics washing. This is what you do because you can't agree on anything else. No sanctions, no enforcement, no consequences. This chapter tries to look at how practically in the field, these innovation labs that we're working on disaster ethics tried to take what they were told by the international donors and use it actively and practically. And so that's the book. It covers kind of global scope and very hopefully accessible writing. Yes. And I should also say that, this is the golden era of humanitarian funding. So this was a project that received 10 million pounds to do disaster innovation. That's just a lot of money. That's sort of pre-Brexit funding. But today, increasingly, the humanitarian sector is downsizing. I don't think necessarily that's a problem. The sector has grown enormously, but this book is some sort of golden age for the funding, where the sector is growing and growing and growing. It's looking different today. So I have themes in this book, hopefully. And what I want to say, and this is where we get to the digital transformation part, is the first thing we're seeing is that you're reordering interventions around data. So basically, you can increasingly only see what you have data about, but the data also governs what are your actionable alternatives. And with AI, which I am assuming we're going to discuss in the next section, this is obviously sort of accelerating. Second point is that the transformation of the field has also led to new spaces, logics, and interventions. So, there was no humanitarian drone airspace before there were drones, right? But suddenly you have this field up in the air where you can do surveillance, you can do monitoring, you can potentially drop physical goods through cargo drones. Humanitarian cyberspace, it's a space of danger, but it's also in a space of organizing aid. Then you have the logics. So the World Bank became a humanitarian actor a couple of years ago. And suddenly proxy mean welfare testing is humanitarian work. Social protection is seen as humanitarian practice. That's a little surprising. It didn't used to be this way. And then you have the interventions, right? If I have all this data from people receiving money, I think I kind of want to start doing banking. So you also have these mission creeps. The organizations do more and more work. I don't think necessarily, it's not always a problem, but I think it requires vigilance, because after all, these are organizations that are not elected, they're not democratic. The people who use their services are not citizens of humanitarian space. There's no governance in the classical sense of sort of rule of law. So the fact that this sector might shrink, it's not necessarily bad news. I talked about the digital body, how that's really sort of the vehicle for operations. And I keep pointing there as I'm expecting to see the screen, but And then, what do we do with all this data? So most of the organizations have moved from their little puny database in the local office in Khartoum or Kampala to be part of these global databases. So UNHCR has one called CRIses. UNICEF has Primero, World Food Program has Scope. So this would be both sort of on the management side, all the databases that, CMI has or PRIO has or university has, coupled with, WASH databases, protection databases, logistics, for example. I mean, it's enormous. This means that also you have targets, right? So this is done for efficiency and for professionalizing everything. But it also means that you have giant targets just sitting around. It also means that this is something we can't protect, right? So when the ICRC got hacked, they said that 500,000 profiles were accessed. The problem is that in the Restoring Family Links program, which is a very trusted and long-term program, whereby the ICRC helps people reunite with their families, they had irregular migrants. So in Norway, for example, the Norwegian Red Cross went to the national security authorities to report this. This happened in other countries. And, as an irregular migrant, maybe the Red Cross going to the national authorities for security surveillance wasn't what I thought when I signed up here. And also, so these files are really delicate. So if you're looking for your family, to find my family, I'm going to talk about all my family. I'm going to talk about my village. Here was the school. Here's the local mayor. I mean, there's just so much data in these files that have been uploaded globally. And there's no way of protecting this. The interesting thing is that the ICRC really handled this head on, but they took it offline. And one of the grievances was that they say, usually we are able to reunite an average of 12 people daily. And you have 12 people. Is that enough to justify this risk? What about 5? Is 5 enough? Is 11 enough? I mean, how do we know, right? It's what are the trade-offs here? And the fact that everybody was doing this meant that we never had a conversation. We never had the critical conversation we could have had. And of course, often they also scream privileges and immunities at the UN level if you try to talk about cyber attacks. And then the risk, right? I mean, obviously, humanitarians can put communities at risk. Leak data about women at risk, for example. I mean, if you leak data about women who are raped in Camp A, you guys know that the security for these women will be catastrophically impaired. We also put ourselves at risk. So the classic example is it's a fun example, actually. So back in a decade ago, there is a bunker near the Turkish border with sort of Daesh soldiers attacking refugees trying to flee. So you have this aid worker tweeting actually the coordinates of this bunker and asking coalition forces to bomb it, which is not so neutral and impartial and humanitarian, right? About 3 minutes after this, Daesh, from their Twitter account, starts tweeting, "We're coming for you, Mr. Aid Worker. We know where you are." Right? So we put ourselves at risk too. Location-wise, in terms of the operations, in terms of who you're working with. Then there's obviously this risk of failing, but there's also the risk of success, right? So if I'm managing to implement possibly an experimental humanitarian program very quickly for tons of data, such as, for example, with biometrics, without really having policies in place, that's a problem. And this is where the extraction comes in, right? So who gets what? The importance of data relations. We talk about, surveillance capitalism. In the humanitarian sector, it's surveillance capitalism, but it's also a sector that thrives on suffering, right? This imagery of needy children, of othering people, very stratified, very sort of shaped by colonial imageries. And this sort of continues. I mean, the tech colonialism really also shapes what's happening in this field. Increasingly, I'm not going to say we have a decline of stuff. I mean, obviously, lots of goods are shipped around, but increasingly the aid is focusing on delivering and processing information, meaning that the funding goes in different directions than before. A lot of you are very familiar with the Latin American scholarship on extractivism. Maybe this is some sort of new extractivism of data. So humanitarians claim to be apolitical. Very often the work that humanitarians do is some sort of appeasement, right? Of clearing a field for maybe capitalist interventions, clearing a field for restarting markets. But it is moving, it is part of a more global system of extractivism. And I think a lot of this is experimentalism as well. Particularly with drones, I mean, just very many strange things have been happening. So you have inventors having a solution, needing a problem. Very often they will then call up the logistics person, the procurement person in an organization and say, hey, I have an app, or I have a drone, or would you like to buy? I can save people. This will be a revolution in aid. This will be a game changer. This has happened over and over and over again. I mean, if you talk to any staff working on this, their eyes will sort of glaze over. My favorite is the guy who invented the edible drone, where the edible drone would be sent to famine hit areas and they could just eat it, actually. I don't know, raw cooked. I mean, it just, there's so many wrong things with this, right? But a lot of this has been, experimental. There's nothing wrong with experimenting with trialing and testing if you have protocols, if you have, organized your project. But trying to trial and test in a dangerous context where the population has little or no saying of being involved in this project is deeply problematic and also very often illegal. So what do we do? I mean, how do we think about this as politics? And this is where, we can think together. I think the next session, and this is where I'm trying to land this and move into the rest of the day. It's clear that this is political. It's also clear that humanitarians again and again look to technology to pretend like it can save them from the political discussion. So last summer, I wrote 3 blog posts calling together everything that had been written about AI in the sector. So for those of you writing books or long papers, you just quit this. Write blog posts. I mean, this has been read by a lot of people in the sector. They're super happy because they're blogs, not strange academic stuff. It's a little disconcerting, but it's also very nice to sort of be able to be part of the discussion. So in the last year, I spent a lot of time traveling on the back of these 3 blog posts. It is a game changer. But what the game is, I think, for the sector and what change, I think it's not sure. Some people hope that AI will do a lot for them. I think it's pretty clear that it doesn't solve all the political problems we have, and it might create some new. Humanitarians really dislike law that's not IHL. The question is if the EU AI Act is a game changer. GDPR has been a little bit of a vector in trying to get law into the humanitarian field. I think maybe the AI Act is sort of going to help us to sort of move this along. So I don't have this open access, but I'm very happy to share PDFs of the chapters if you email me. I do think that the discussion ends with how we deal with artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence somehow is going to eat up all the other data practices that are circulating in the field. And then we'll see how it goes. Thank you.
And you make us think about things that we have never even considered before, which is at least not by habit, except when I listen to the private video. So this is fascinating. Please, I want to invite the other panelists to this. It's a very small roundtable, but it is a roundtable, sort of. And of course, like always, we will have an opportunity for all of you to ask questions in a little while. But before we do, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Lisa Bernet. She is a law transformer. She's part of our group. She's also she finished a master's at the University of Bergen in system dynamics, and was a student at CMI as well. And she also has a background as an activist and also still working as an activist in Sudan. So, and her thesis actually intersects with some of the same issues. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And then before, I'll just also introduce the third panelist tonight, who many of you will already have seen, Omar Ba, who's associate professor at Cornell University, and he works on the various issues of international development. So we have a really, really great panel. And Javier, please start.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I had a chance to go to the book, and it's quite interesting. I want today to give some example of what could be like humanitarian extractivism in Sudan. I focus my thesis on using system dynamic to analyze the aid supply chain to Sudan. Through that, I had the opportunity to conduct interviews with the various stakeholders that are involved in this supply chain. In Sudan, the international organization collected data through the local actors or through what is locally known as observators. So they collected data on the internal displaced versions and on people who are affected by conflict. This data is quite often include versional details, and it's used for research and fundraising. And I think this there is a kind of exploiting for the local community here, because when we look to the aid supply chain to Sudan, the fund comes from the donor and then it goes to the international NGOs. And these organizations, they have like they allocate like from 40% to 60% of this aid to their operation cost. And of course, their staff get like a decent salary, and then what's remaining of that goes to the local NGOs. The local NGOs also allocate like from 20 to 40% of it to their operation cost. And then the local workers who are actually working on the ground and collecting the data and distributing the aid, they don't, they are unpaid volunteers. Here, when you look to the system, for the accountability system, for example, it's a top-down approach. So the local NGOs are required to show their budget to the international organization, but the reverse isn't true. So I believe the international organization or the accountability should go both ways, since those international organization has used to be the data that has been collected by unpaid local actors for their fundraising. So this is kind of maybe what you call labor extractivism, I think. Yeah, I think that's the example I wanted to share.
That is, thank you. That is really, really interesting. One more comment. Omar.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristin, for writing this book. Yes, I had to enjoy reading two chapters. I think I had a good book. And I'll give a bit of an outsider perspective here, and then probably provide a couple of comments / questions. My main takeaway from this is both that this is again theoretically rich, that is also empirically grounded, and shows that this is also from the perspective of your large experience on the ground in these humanitarian spaces. My main takeaway is also that humanitarian extractivism that to be used here as your analytical framework points to not only the digital transformation of the nature of aid, but also its future. We see then the emergence of what we call the digital body. And this digital body leads to a reconfiguration of the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian space and the relationship between both the deliverers of humanitarian aid, but also the receivers and the whole ecosystem around it, which accelerates the vulnerability. In the book, we talk about centralization of the vulnerability, but also the dimension of vulnerability. Maybe something that could be added to that would also how the vulnerability itself is accelerated, the speed at which those user values can be destroyed or affected negatively is at an increasing speed. So there's that acceleration mechanism there. Another thing that might be worth considering is the question of humanitarian extractivism, not only from the digital and technological lens, but also in the market economy. In the context of liberalism, corporatism, and startup criticism. So this is also another angle to add to this television is operating and changing through this digital market economy model. One example, there are a few quotes in the book, a few statements that you put out there that are quoted from the World Program to the UNHCR and ICRC. And reading the statement from these organizations, I was able to identify three markers, the same vocabulary that was used in the corporation. A few examples. Business model, added value, performance, mainstreaming services, increasing agility or being nimble, maximizing the value assets. So all these are markers, these are code words basically that come straight out of the banking industry and then the rest of the calculations. So in this sense, we can then say that we do have now QR codes, but these QR codes are also still barcodes. It's still a market dimension to this digitalization of what they need. Another point is also probing you did mention your presentation is the traditional principles of humanitarianism, sexuality, equality, independence, and how the current digital innovation will influence, or what does these traditional principles mean in the current context of crowdsourcing of humanitarian aid and spaces, citizen-led humanitarian startups or humanitarianism, mutual aid initiatives, funding platforms, and all these. So, what are the implications of this ecosystem of humanitarian intervention, and what does it do to the traditional principles of the public community? Another point that I would like to hear more about is what you call the biopower literature on extractivism and the humanitarian government policy. This is maybe a bit my theoretical information that I would have loved to hear more of people being brought into this
Thank you so much. Lot of great perspectives. I'm not going to give you the word because I realized that even if we're going to withdraw the breaks, since people were late, we don't have so much time. So I want to give people a chance to speak. And here, of course, we have a very fun thing. So now we need to raise your hand. And I'll go to the other. Then you go to it.
Yes. Thank you all.
Just turn around and get it to Elena.
Hey, thank you very much. The way that what are the goals, how we how we or control the for example, during the pandemic, we did not identify Zambia, we did not identify. So, is there a way of like you mentioned, it's quite difficult to I feel when I have practiced how to decide to care and the question being they want to operate A can be the same so I'm curious to hear from the way that how do you sorry. Okay. So two questions. One is with the identification of the space and the idea that A comes in numbers and so on. What appeals to publics is of course stories. And I'm wondering whether the identification of humanitarian assistance has gotten the whole sector to think less about what appeals to publics to generate sympathy for humanitarian effort, which is, like the women in returns who were killed in the company to get this, the story that really has been sort of multiplied regardless of the numbers. And the second thing has to do with the interoperability of these databases. And which I'm putting in touch with a guy at the University of Edinburgh named Gavin Sullivan, who's been looking at the demands of the UN Security Council to make all these UN databases interoperable with the security databases. so that they can prevent terrorists from traveling and stuff. And so it has to do with the kind of the way these databases are set up to be linked when necessary. And it's a real UN push coming from the security concern. That's 50 years of.
Susanna. And then I go back.
This is really actually a follow-up on the last thing you made. I was wondering about with the way data tends to stay, the way the longevity of data players, and how this negatively influence, well, one thing, if there's a mistake somewhere, it will be there for everything. But also how surveillance is endlessly copied the mistakes of mistakes. And I wonder how, and what I wonder about is how do humanitarian organizations talk about these risks? How do they try to acknowledge and do something about them? Very much.
And now I'm not allowing any more questions because I really want to hear some of your answers. And you can have 3 minutes.
Thank you for great questions. Rachel DNA. We've actually written a different article on Australian lawyer who wanted to use the DNA of mixed race kids in the field to find pedophile daddies. I mean, that article deals with a lot, but it is, Trump used this on the Mexican border. It's unregulated, poorly done. It's been an issue in peacekeeping for a long time. There was a suggestion to take the DNA of all peacekeepers, and then the union intervened and saying no other humanitarian sector is asked to give up their DNA. But it's coming as it gets easier. So it's slow, but when you look up humanitarian organizations and peacekeeping organizations, there's more talk about DNA today. So we're not here now, but we will be here, I think, in 5 years. And it has these implications of linking people. Your daddy's a warlord, you never knew him, but you can. I mean, there are possible big uses as well, right? But it's coming. And it sticks to you in a very different way. UNRWA, I mean, this is a conversation I think the sector needs to have if this ever ends. The question is if the sector shouldn't have been doing that job all these years. Because it's really paid for the application and it's really enabled the status quo. I mean, I think there's nothing that I can say about it. But the question is, humanitarian sector to the sector, 3 decades ago, benefits of the tech and neoliberal. I'm sort of tempted to give you half an hour to talk about this. Of course, we're not going to go back to having no tech. And the sector is transforming like everyone else, right? So maybe it's just an appendage to global politics. I think there's good uses, but I think having these conversations all the time. And really, we don't have any vocabulary to talk about rights and law and litigation in the sector. It's a different conversation. It's all the things you guys are focusing on here. It's a norm. I've tried to put together a community practice and humanitarian lawyers. Type is okay. They never talk to anyone else about this before. If you do corporate diligence in humanitarian organization, you're like at the bottom of, you're like fresh. But you're very disrespectful in country. So there is no accountability. And this really worries me. Datafication of stories. We have a different small initiative called Knowing A. Artificial intelligence that you can do. And we try to look at what happens when organizations use their skills. Amnesty did this last year with government activists. It's really something they're thinking about. It's sort of backfiring, but it also does create distrust, right? So how can you create trust? Not only with respect to numbers and needs assessments, but also the actual story about what's going on. And this is going on into this global discussion about disinformation, misinformation, right? So, the sector is struggling to maintain truth of scale. So any technology that sort of will track disinformation and can't be local languages, you're missing whole topics of reality. You might have, genocidal language.
being pushed out and your AI transforms. And this is really from last level. So the GDPR, ongoing difficult. To sum up, humanitarians have suffered some information that took for so long. Now they can have everything. So minimization is really what we're trying to do. To, to get themselves into less problems by encouraging people to collect less and use it only for what they think they need. Although it's tempting to become. Sorry, thank you.
No, sorry, this was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. And it is such a perfect segue into the next session on responsible AI governance. So you will have 4 minutes to get a cup of coffee, get that. But it's not, nothing is far here, so you will do that. And it will be
If you were interested in the book, I'll email you the chapter. Just send me an email.